I had always been a night owl, working late into the quiet hours when everything outside my window was silent, and the world felt like it belonged to me. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I welcomed it. It was peaceful. I thought I had the streets to myself when I finished my work and headed home at midnight. But that night, I'd be proven wrong. The bus stop was quiet. There were no other passengers in sight. I checked my watch, 12:15 a.m. My usual bus was running late, but that wasn't unusual for this time of night. I shifted from one foot to the other, trying to shake off the cold, and looked up the street, expecting to see the familiar headlights rounding the corner. But then I noticed something strange. The street seemed emptier than usual, and the shadows looked deeper. I could barely make out the outline of an old figure sitting on the bench across from me. His head was lowered, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't move when I glanced over, just sat there, still as stone. At first, I thought he might be asleep, or perhaps he was just waiting for a bus like I was. But there was something about him, something off. His clothes were old, ragged, and worn, and the closer I looked, the more I realized I couldn't see his face clearly. His head was angled downward, and his hat shadowed his features. But there was something about his posture, like he was waiting for something or someone. I shook my head. Maybe I was just tired, seeing things. The bus was probably just running late. Then I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate steps that echoed on the empty street. I didn't turn around at first, but the noise was unmistakable. Someone was walking, and the steps were too close. I turned over my shoulder, half expecting to see another late-night traveler, but the street was empty. My heartbeat quickened, but I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably just the wind, or maybe the echo of a car that passed by long ago. I tried to focus on the bus schedule, but the strange feeling persisted. That's when I heard a voice. A raspy, almost whispering voice. "Are you waiting for the bus too?" I froze. The voice didn't come from behind me, where I expected to hear it. It came from across the street, from the figure sitting on the bench. I turned toward him, and I don't know why, but I took a step closer. The man hadn't moved, but his head was now tilted upward, revealing just enough of his face to send a chill through my spine. It wasn't his face that scared me, though. It was his eyes. They were too wide, almost unnaturally so, and his skin looked stretched and worn, like he'd been around much longer than a normal person should. There was something in his gaze, something that made me feel like he wasn't looking at me but through me. I took a step back. My mind raced. What kind of person sat out here this late, especially in the middle of nowhere? Was he sick? Lost? But before I could make a move, the bus pulled around the corner, headlights cutting through the dark. I saw the familiar green sign on the front, and without thinking, I hurried toward it. I was so ready to get away from the strange man. The doors of the bus opened, and I stepped inside. The driver was asleep, his head leaning back against the seat. The interior was completely empty. I sat down, still trying to shake the unease from my bones. I had made it. I was safe. But something nagged at me, pulling at my thoughts. I looked out the window, watching the empty street pass by. And then I saw it. The same man, standing by the bus stop, still staring in my direction. But this time, his eyes were wide open, staring directly at me through the glass. He was no longer sitting. He was standing, and his posture was wrong, like he wasn't supposed to be moving at all. And his mouth. His lips were stretched, but not into a smile. They were contorted, like they were trying to say something, but no sound came. I jumped back in my seat, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned away, telling myself it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. I glanced around. The bus was empty, just me and the driver. I tried to breathe deeply, forcing myself to calm down. The lights outside flickered, but that was normal for these older buses. I leaned back in the seat, willing the night to just end. But then the bus slowed down. We were coming to a stop. Confused, I looked up at the driver, wondering why we were stopping. He didn't move. His hands gripped the wheel, his body still, his eyes closed. And that's when I heard it again. That raspy voice, but this time, it came from behind me. "You're not alone." I whipped around, but there was no one there. The seats were empty. The bus was still, except for the man. He was standing in the aisle, his head tilted to the side, eyes locked on mine, his lips stretched into that unnatural grin again. Before I could scream, the bus lurched forward. I turned to see the street outside change. The familiar city lights disappeared, replaced by a blackness so deep it felt like we were no longer on Earth. The air grew thick, suffocating. The man stepped closer, and his raspy whisper filled my ears, now far too close. It's always midnight when the passenger arrives. I felt the blood drain from my face as the world around me grew darker and colder. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't on my way home anymore. As the bus lurched forward, I tried to steady myself, but my grip on the seat was weak, my heart still racing. The lights outside blinked erratically, casting long, twisted shadows on the windows. The streets I had known, familiar and comforting, were now a blur, fading into an abyss that stretched beyond the world I recognized. The air inside the bus felt colder, and the silence was suffocating. I could no longer hear the hum of the engine. It was as though the bus was floating through some limbo where time didn't exist. The bus driver remained motionless, eyes closed, as though he was oblivious to the strange atmosphere enveloping us. It didn't take long before I realized something even more chilling. The bus wasn't meant for the living. The passengers, if they could even be called that, were all gone. The seats were now filled with transparent figures, their outlines barely visible in the dim light. They sat still, staring ahead, unmoving, as though they were waiting for something or someone, perhaps for the journey to end. And then I looked down at my own hands. The skin, once warm and full of life, seemed to have taken on a faint, almost ghostly hue. I touched my face, and it was as though I was feeling someone else's skin. I wasn't sure if I was still breathing. The man, the one who had been following me, was no longer standing in the aisle. His cold eyes locked onto mine, and I realized with a growing sense of horror that he wasn't just a stranger. He was the conductor of this twisted ride, and I was the next passenger. The feeling of being trapped sank in deeper. The bus was a vessel for the dead, and I had unwittingly stepped aboard. I wasn't going home. The destination wasn't a place I knew. It was an ending, a journey no one who was alive was supposed to take. And I was already too far gone to turn back. I gasped for air, my chest rising and falling in frantic desperation. The suffocating darkness lifted, replaced by harsh, artificial light. My body jerked as I struggled to move, only to find wires attached to my arms, a beeping monitor beside me. My breath hitched. Where was I? The bus. The conductor. The dead. But no, this wasn't the bus. This was the hospital. My mind reeled as I tried to piece everything together. I had been on that cursed ride, trapped with something inhuman. I had seen my fate. I had felt it. So why was I here? A nurse rushed in, startled by my sudden movements. "You're awake," she said, relief evident in her voice. "You were unconscious for hours. Do you remember what happened?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. The last thing I remembered was staring into the cold, unblinking eyes of the conductor. I wasn't supposed to be here. "Sir, you were attacked," she continued gently. "You were found unconscious in an alley. Your wallet and phone were gone. You were robbed." Robbed? The explanation made sense, but it didn't feel right. My hands trembled as I touched my chest, half expecting to feel the lingering chill of death itself. Had it all been a hallucination? A near-death dream? And yet, as I turned my head slightly, my breath caught in my throat. The window beside my bed reflected my pale, shaken face. But behind me, barely visible in the dim light of the hospital room, stood a man in a uniform. His eyes were cold, his expression unreadable. The conductor. My heart slammed against my ribs. I had escaped the ride, but somehow he had followed me.